Culture, Boosting Employee Engagement, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Michael Lee Stallard. Today's webinar will last around 1 hour. If you have any questions, you can always type them into the questions box. We will be answering these questions as they come in live at the end of the presentation or as a follow-up by email. My name is Sarah Schaefer, and I will moderate today's webinar. Michael Lee Stallard is president of E Pluribus Partners, a leadership training and consulting firm. He speaks and teaches at a wide variety of business, government, healthcare, and education organizations. Michael is the primary author of the book Fired Up or Burned Out: How to Reignite Your Team's Passion, Creativity, and Productivity, and his most recent, Connection Culture: The Competitive Advantage of Shared Identity, Empathy, and Understanding at Work. He writes the CEO Advisor column for foxbusiness.com and is a regular contributor to Smart Briefs. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Sarah, thank you very much. It's good to be with all of you, and we appreciate you joining us. On this webcast, we're going to talk about culture, the predominant attitudes, language, and behavior of a group. And the type of culture we're going to talk about, a connection culture, has several benefits. Number one, it helps you. Connection has been called a superpower. It makes us more productive, healthier, and happier. It also produces a culture where people want to give their best efforts. They want to align their behavior with organizational goals, with the leader's goals. They also communicate better, they're more cooperative, and they think about how to innovate. So you think about that set of benefits I just laid out, it ends up being a pretty powerful competitive advantage. And this applies to both teams, it applies to departments, it applies to entire organizations, but it also applies to your family and organizations you're involved in your communities. So you'll find this very broadly relevant. Now, as we get in here, hopefully I can advance the slides here, Sarah. Can you make sure I have control?
Okay. Is it moving?
I'm not able to move the slides.
Okay. Did you click on the PowerPoint and then also just, there you go.
There we go. Okay.
Right, perfect.
Well, let me start out with a story. I started out, my first career was on Wall Street, and I worked for Morgan Stanley and head of marketing for part of Charles Schwab, and worked for a money management firm. And I saw over the course of my career how many mergers did not work well after the merger was consummated. There was always a rational plan going into the merger, but it was the failure of cultures to mix and the failure of people to connect that sabotaged our post-merger performance. And eventually I decided to leave Wall Street in 2002, and I founded a new firm called E Pluribus Partners, which has a funny name. It's based on America's motto, E Pluribus Unum. In other words, E Pluribus Unum is a Latin phrase that means out of many, one. And our focus is how do you get a group of people to act as one, to move in the same direction, to give their best efforts, some of those benefits that I talked about earlier. And about a year into starting the company, I had a personal situation that really clarified the importance of this for me. My wife, Katie, was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2003, at the end of 2003, and then in 2004, she was diagnosed with advanced ovarian cancer. Her chances of survival were less than 10%, given that she had had those two cancers so close together. And she did, in early 2004, 6 rounds of chemotherapy at our local hospital here in Greenwich, Connecticut. And we knew we had to be very aggressive to treat this. And so we signed her up for a program called intraperitoneal chemotherapy at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And I will never forget our first visit to Sloan Kettering. We're walking down the street in Midtown Manhattan on 53rd Street, approaching the entrance, and that guy you see in the picture on the screen, Nick Medley, was a doorman at Sloan Kettering, and he locked his eyes on my wife, Katie, and greeted her like a returning friend. Now, this is in Midtown Manhattan where nobody makes eye contact with passersby. So it really caught me by surprise. But I realized that Nick was being intentional about reaching out and connecting with people who he recognized were cancer patients because they were wearing wigs. And he locked his eyes on Katie, greeted us. We entered into the reception area, and there was a receptionist calling everyone honey. This also is very rare in Manhattan, as you would imagine. Then the security people, the administrative people were helpful and friendly. We met with our oncologist, Dr. Marty Hensley. She spent an hour with us, and she laid out the treatment options. She answered our long list of questions, and she was upbeat and optimistic. And by the end of the day, I had two distinct reactions. The first, I had done my research, and I knew this was one of the best teams in the world to treat advanced ovarian cancer. But I had a second reaction that day that really caught me by surprise. I knew they cared because I could feel it. And you know what? At the end of the day, I just came away more optimistic that even though the odds were against us, that maybe with this great team who cares about us, that we could get Katie through this season. And this year, Katie celebrated her 11th year of being cancer-free from advanced ovarian cancer. Now, she did have one recurrence of breast cancer recently, but that's all the treatment's over, and her prospects are very good. So she survived 3 different episodes of primary cancer, really extraordinary. Now, I remember when we were at Sloan Kettering, there was one event that really caught my attention. Katie was having intraperitoneal treatment where they fill her abdomen up with chemo, and it took several hours to do this, and I had stopped to get something to drink at a gift shop, and I came out, and across the way there was a lounge area where employees from that location of Sloan Kettering had gathered to talk about the results of an employee satisfaction survey. And I saw Nick the doorman in there, and I stood and I listened, and I heard people say how much they loved their patients, they loved the people they work with, and they loved their mission to provide the best cancer care anywhere. Well, last year, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center was recognized by U.S. News & World Report as the #1 cancer center in the U.S. And you can bet that they have a passion for task excellence and results. But even just as important as that, they care about their patients. There is a culture that creates connection among the people who work there and with their patients and their patients' families. And it really stood out in comparison to what I had experienced through most of my career on Wall Street. And the data support this too. When you look at the data on employee engagement in general in the U.S., about 70% of employees are self-report that they're not engaged. That number is much higher outside the U.S. So it works out to be about 3 out of 10 employees are engaged by the average manager. But the extraordinary managers, who I describe as leaders because people want to follow them, they engage double that number. It's about 6, on average, 6 out of 10 employees or more for the greatest leaders. So the data really support that all managers are not alike. Some are lead from authority, where people have to follow them because they control raises, hiring, firing, promotion, etc. And then there are leaders who people want to follow because they feel connected to them. Now, in our research, we found that there are 3 types of relational cultures, primarily in organizations. And this applies to teams, applies to departments. And you will find there are cultures of control, cultures of indifference, and I'm going to describe each of these in just a minute, but let me show you the 3. And then finally, cultures that we describe as cultures of connection or connection cultures. Now let's go through each of these. And then we're going to take a poll, and you can tell us what type of culture you believe you're in. Now the first culture is a culture of control. This is a culture where people who have power, control, influence, and status rule over the rest. And I probably don't need to say any more than that. It creates a culture where usually the people who have power, control, influence, and status comprise, on average, about 20% of the organization in terms of people, and they rule over the 80%. And the 80% over time develop a sense of learned helplessness. It's been described as, that I think could also be described as over time becoming learned hopelessness. You know, they stick with the job because they want the paycheck, they have a mortgage, they have to get kids through college perhaps, and so they feel like they're trapped over time, but they have to stay in these cultures to meet their financial obligations. The second type of culture is, and by the way, we see this growing rapidly today in our broader culture, and it's influencing our workplace cultures. It's a culture of indifference, where people are so busy with tasks and their smartphones and media and just all the distractions we have in life that they don't take time to build relationships. And so as a result, many people in the workplace feel unsupported, left out, which is particularly bad, or lonely. And all of these have an effect on our biology, which we'll get into in a minute. But the culture of indifference is growing rapidly today. And having come from Wall Street, I would say most of the cultures on Wall Street are cultures of indifference, where people are just so busy they don't take time to build supportive relationships. And then finally, there's the connection culture. Now, you probably knew this was coming. It's the picture where everyone has their hands together. I probably just need to find a picture where you see people smiling and energetic. It's kind of hard to capture that in a photo, but you get the idea. It's a culture where people feel enthusiastic. They feel energetic. They want to give their best efforts. They cooperate, and you see that they achieve sustainable superior performance over time. In the other cultures, they're average performers over time. And that's not to say that they may not be successful for a period. They're just not sustainable because they're not meeting inherent human needs that we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so I've given you just a quick glimpse of these three types of cultures. And Sarah, if you could launch this poll for us, we're going to take a look at what type of culture you think you're in. So if you could select one of the three following: control is A, indifference is B, option B, and connection is option C. So if you could fill that out, we'll take a look and just see how the numbers turn out. And I'll tell you what the averages typically look like that we see. Okay, we're going to close the poll now. All right, well, this is very interesting. This is I would say, not typical from what we usually see. It looks like we see about 31% are in the culture of control. That's a little higher than average. We usually see right around 25%, plus or minus 2%. So this is a little bit higher than the average. We typically see about 48%, 46 to 48% are cultures of indifference. So this is lower than I would have expected for a sample of this size. It looks like we have about almost 200 people online. So that's a little bit lower than the average, 34%. And then we have 35% report that they're in a culture of connection. That is higher than we typically see. It's usually a little below 25%. Okay, so actually this population on our webinar has a little better, they have on average a better culture than the typical sample size that we see in our work. Okay, all right, let's go back to our slides. All right, oops. Okay, now I want to just explain something. I'm going to get into the science a little bit later, but let me just tell you one part of the science that's especially important to understand. Now, we think of cultures, work environments, as falling into having an effect on the human body that can be described in two ways. One is a state of homeostasis. You might think of it as balance. When the body is in balance, then blood, glucose, and oxygen flows to all the bodily systems at levels that they need to maintain good health and operation over time. But when we feel threatened, our body shifts to a state called the stress response. So blood, glucose, and oxygen is over-allocated to the heart, to the lungs, to the big muscles like the thighs. It's preparing the body to fight or flee the threat that it perceives in the broader environment. And at the same time, the body robs Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. In other words, it's taking blood, glucose, and oxygen from other body systems, including the brain, so that it affects cognitive function, and it has an effect on memory if we're stuck in a state of stress response for too long. It also affects the digestive system so that we become vulnerable to digestive disorders like acid reflux or colitis or other digestive disorders of those sorts. It also affects the immune system so that we're more vulnerable to sickness and disease. And, you know, if we're facing a mugger and we need to respond with a stress response that is over a short period of time, that's fine. But what we're seeing today is more people are affected by psychological stress. And so the stress response, it's almost like the gas pedal on the car is stuck to the floorboard. It's going to burn out the engine. And that is effectively what's happening to our bodies if we're stuck in a state of stress response. Now, you see in this diagram that the stress response, or homeostasis, is really driven by subjective feelings or emotions. If we feel connected, if we feel supported, if we feel included, it helps protect us from, even when threats exist in the environment, we feel safe because we have people around us who have our back. We feel connected to them. However, if we feel disconnected, unsupported, left out, or lonely, we're very vulnerable to stress, to anxiety, to depression, and ultimately to addiction, because when we don't feel well because our body is stuck in the state of stress response, we start looking for behaviors that will make us feel better. Almost all of those behaviors, other than connection, are addictive. And they require more of the same behavior over time to produce the same effect, so they gradually take over our lives. Some of those behaviors include addictions to alcohol, to illegal drugs or the abuse of legal drugs, addictions to sex, pornography, shopping, exercise can even be an addiction, and of course work. So all of these things are addictive. About half the academic research shows that there's a set of about 8 addictive behaviors that over half of Americans are addicted to that has a negative effect on their health. And that's something I actually sourced the research in our new book, Connection Culture, The Competitive Advantage of Shared Identity, Empathy, and Understanding at Work. We cite our sources on that. So I'm using this term connection. Let me just define it for you. We describe connection as a bond based on shared identity, empathy, and understanding that moves self-centered individuals, that's most of us, towards group-centered membership. Now, certainly we have we have a mix of motives in us. At times we're self-centered. At other times we have more of a service mindset, helping others. But oftentimes we are in the self-centered orientation, and it requires a connection within the group, a feeling of connection to the group that gets us to move towards group-centered membership. I love the basketball coach Phil Jackson. He described it this way: surrendering the me for the we. In fact, just a very quick story. Michael Jordan, when he graduated from the University of North Carolina, he was almost immediately on the cover of Sports Illustrated magazine. But then a number of years after that, the Bulls really didn't live up to their potential, and the owners of the Bulls, the Chicago Bulls, made a coaching change. They fired the head coach, and they elevated Phil Jackson to become the head coach. And Phil sat down with Michael and said, you know, Michael, you're the man. You're going to be a great, one of the all-time greats by the time your career is ended. But you know, Michael, we're not going to win NBA championships unless you surrender the me for the we. He told Michael, he observed that Michael spent more time with his entourage than with his teammates, and he really needed to be intentional about connecting with them and helping elevate their performance, getting to know them, and by doing that, he would elevate the performance of the whole team. And what I love about Michael Jordan is that he did that. He started showing up early to practice and working out with the rookies. He started helping some of the more senior members on the team with their endurance, and of course, after that, the Chicago Bulls won 6 NBA championships. So Michael surrendered the me for the we, and as a leader on that team, he connected with the rest of his team, and it really made a difference. Now, this is our model of a connection culture and what it looks like. Let me just walk you through this from left to right. Now, what we find is that almost all leaders are focused on task excellence and results, and we have to be, right? Because we are being paid to deliver results. So that's critical. But what differentiates the manager who gets the 3 out of 10 people engaged versus the leader who engages 6 or more is, in addition to focusing on task excellence and results, they are also intentional about developing relationship excellence or connection. And they do this in 3 very predictable ways. Number 1, they communicate an inspiring vision and live it. They value people and they give them a voice. And that's what differentiates a manager from a leader, so that people want to give their best efforts, align their behavior with organizational goals, fully communicate and cooperate and innovate so that the organization keeps improving its performance over time. Now, when people don't feel connected, take, for example, new people into organizations. They want to make a contribution early on, and they come in expecting the best of their organization, but within about 6 months, most people don't experience connection. And so their motivation, their energy, their engagement levels fall off dramatically when they don't experience that sense of connection in the first 6 months. But the opposite is true too. If leaders are intentional about connecting with people, then we see them engage, we see that relationship excellence developed, and that in combination with being intentional about task excellence produces sustainable superior performance. Now let's contrast that versus the other cultures we talked about, the culture of control and the culture of indifference. In those cultures, also managers are intentional about trying to achieve task excellence and results. However, they're not intentional about developing connection or relationship excellence. And so over time, there's a failure of developing strong relationships, and disconnection sets in. Disconnection isolates people. It isolates managers. It isolates individual contributors or employees, and it creates these, as you can see on that graphic, it creates almost these brick walls among people. There isn't trust. There's less cooperation. And when people are isolated and lonely, they don't perform well. As we talked about earlier, they're more vulnerable to stress, anxiety, depression, and addiction, and that sabotages their performance. Okay, let's go through the 3 elements that I talked about of connection culture: vision, value, and voice. I want to give you definitions and just talk about those briefly. Okay, the first element, we call this the 3V leadership model, by the way: vision, value, and voice. It's very simple, it's very memorable, and it's very actionable, as you'll see. Now, vision is defined as when everyone in the organization is motivated by mission, united by the values, and proud of the reputation. So take, for example, the example I used earlier was Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And you see in the people, they are motivated by the mission, which I briefly mentioned. It's to provide the best cancer care anywhere. It's very aspirational. You'll find a lot of people in that organization whose lives are somehow touched by cancer, including Nick the doorman, Nick Medley, who I mentioned. Nick is a cancer survivor himself who attributes his survival to the treatment he received at Sloan Kettering. United by the values, those are the core values of the organization. And so at a place like Sloan Kettering, you'll see, a passion for excellence, caring about patients and their families and one another from an employee standpoint. So those are just some of the values that really connect with the people there. And then finally, that produces a reputation that people are either proud of, they're indifferent to, or they're embarrassed by. In the case of Sloan Kettering, they're proud of it, and it certainly helps that they've been recognized as the #1 cancer center in the U.S. by U.S. News and World Report. So they really have hit the trifecta at Sloan Kettering when it comes to the element of vision and connecting with employees of that organization. And vision creates a shared identity that unites people, that brings them together. Now let's run a poll here on vision. I want to see how you feel the vision is in your organization. Is it on a scale of 1 to 5 strong, being 5 the highest, 4 better than average, 3 average, 2 less than average, or #1 weak? So let's launch the poll here and see how we look. Okay, let's close out the poll now. We've had more than 3/4 of the people have voted. Okay, so we have 11% say strong. These are really good numbers. 36% better than average, 33% average, and then you can see about 21% less than average or weak. Okay, these are pretty good numbers, and that's typically what we see versus the other elements we're going to talk about, value and voice. Vision tends to be, in the average organization, pretty good. It's not to say that there isn't room for improvement, but these numbers are pretty strong. Okay, let's close out the poll and go back to our slides. Now the next element is value, and let me say this about value. Value is the heart of a connection culture. Now when I use the term value, I'm not talking about values that we mentioned under vision. Those are core values. I'm talking about, do people feel valued as human beings, or do they feel they're being treated as human doings, that they're just there because they produce results, or are they valued as for themselves because they breathe and walk? And so here's the definition of value. When everyone in the organization understands the needs of people, and I'm going to describe that in a little bit, the 6 universal human needs at work, and secondly, appreciates their positive, unique contributions. So people are expressing that appreciation, and thirdly, they're going beyond vocally expressing appreciation to also actively help others achieve their potential. So those are the 3 elements that create value. People understand the needs of people, appreciate their positive, unique contributions, and help them achieve their potential. And when value exists, it creates a sense of shared empathy where people care about one another, and people can feel that. It's what I felt as a family member of a patient at Sloan Kettering. I could sense that empathy that they had for one another, for their patients and their patients' families. And that's a very powerful competitive advantage to have in terms of uniting people so that they really care about the organization and want to give their best efforts. Okay, let's take the poll, launch our poll, and see how value is in your organization. Okay, let's close out the poll now. Most people have voted. And okay, this doesn't surprise me. You see that only 31% are better than average. So there's a lot of room to improve in terms of value. And as I said, value is the heart of a connection culture. So this is especially important that employees in the organization, that people feel valued. So we can see there's a lot of room for improvement here. So let's go back to our slides. Here we go. And the next element in a connection culture is voice. And let me define that. When everyone in the organization seeks the ideas of others, so in other words, this reflects humility, that leaders and people understand that they don't have a monopoly on good ideas, and they need to seek the opinions and ideas of others. They also share their opinions and ideas and opinions honestly, so that they're candid, they're open and honest, and they tell people what they believe rather than what the person wants to hear, even when that can be dangerous to do so, because the person may not want to hear it. And then finally, when you have voice in an organization or in a team, there are a lot of conversations, and sometimes things are misconstrued, and it results in a breakdown of relational connections. So in organizations that have voice and teams that have voice, they are intentional about safeguarding relational connections, and they understand just how important they are, because if relational connections are broke, it starts to create these traps of knowledge so that people become isolated and sabotages performance, and that's something I get deeper into the book. And voice creates a shared understanding so that people know where we're going as a team, why it's important to get there, how we're going to get there, those types of things. And it makes it easier for them to align their behavior with the team's goals, with the leader's goals, with the organization's goals. And those 3 things together create that strong sense of connection. So let's see how voice is in your organization. So if you could vote, we're going to open our poll here. There it is. Okay, let's close it out now. Almost 3/4 of the people have voted. Okay, once again, a lot of room for improvement here. This is what I was saying earlier, that voice is typically, vision is pretty strong, but there's, in most organizations, a lot of room for improvement on value and on voice. And you can see that only 22% say that we are, 23% say that their organization has voice that's better than average or strong. Okay, so there's a lot of room for improvement, and about 1/3 say that it's average. Okay, let's go back to our slides. Here we go, okay. Now let me just share a little bit more about the research. And in our book, we go through and have a whole chapter on the science of connection. And oftentimes when we're working with groups like the engineering section at the NASA Johnson Space Center, or the doctors and scientists at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, we'll spend a half a day on the research. So this is just a flyby, but it'll give you an idea of some of the all these different areas that we looked into pointed in the same direction, just the importance of connection. So let's just go through a couple of these. First of all, from psychology research, and a lot of people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but that was more than 60 years ago now, and we've learned some things since. And Maslow, for the most part, got it right, but there are some new things we've learned that are relevant to just feeling connected and motivation in the context of culture. So now the first need that we identified that you see in the research is just respect. And you think when you first come into an organization, when people don't know you, you at least expect them to respect you, to be respectful. And if they're not, it makes you angry, and it's hard to perform at the top of your game if you're distracted because you're angry or you feel disrespected. And as time goes on, you get a chance to show what you can do in terms of your work, you are hoping to be recognized. If your boss and the people you work with affirm your task strengths and perhaps your character strengths, like you're persevering and you have a passion for excellence in your work, those types of things, then it gives you energy. But if you don't get that feedback, if you don't get that recognition, then it starts to drain energy out of you. That's a human need that we have, to be recognized for the work we're doing in the workplace. And then finally, we need to belong. We need this sense of connection to a group of people who have our backs. And I think of this in both a positive way and a negative way. Let me describe the negative way. We experience some difficult times in life. Like, for example, I told you about my wife Katie's 3 episodes of cancer. And during that time, we had our friends, our family members, colleagues who really stepped up and helped us get through a tough time in life. You know, people experience death of family members, sickness and disease, divorce, loss of jobs, etc., things like that. And we need people who have our backs in life to help us to get through those tough times. Now, also, on the more of a positive note, we all have opportunities to learn and grow. And we learn and grow best in a culture where there are mentors, where there are coaches, people who care enough about us to tell us when they see us doing something that's not in our best interest, or to help us learn and grow in an area that we need to develop. And so that sense of belonging, those people who support us, who help us achieve our potential, that's that need for belonging that we have. Now notice that the first 3 needs here are all relational in nature. And so it's those interactions we have with people that meet half of the needs in the workplace to thrive. Now the next 2 needs are called task mastery needs. The first one is autonomy or freedom. Think of that as if you have an over-controlling boss, or you work in an environment where there's too much bureaucracy or red tape, that slows you down. It's hard to thrive in that type of culture where you feel like you're fighting those controls all the time. And then secondly, we need to be in a role that's a good fit with our strengths. That's the personal growth piece. When we're in a role that's a good fit with our strengths and provides the right degree of challenge, in other words, it's not over-challenging so that we're stressed out, or under-challenging so that we're bored, but it's in that sweet spot of challenge, we experience what psychologists call flow, or optimal experience. And I think of it as we feel immersed in our work, and the hours fly by. It's like we've entered into a time warp. That's experiencing personal growth, and that's good for us. That makes us feel connected to our work. And then finally, when our work meets the need for meaning. And I think of Nick the doorman. Here's a guy who is a cancer survivor working at a cancer center. So you can bet that job he has, being on the front lines of a cancer center, provides meaning for him. And when we have that in our lives, we tend to be more resilient. We tend to work through obstacles, and it helps us thrive over a longer time in our careers. Now, the neuroscience research also confirms the importance of connection. Now, I've told you about the endocrine system and how blood, glucose, oxygen, and how it's distributed throughout the body, whether we're in a stress response or a state of homeostasis. But let me tell you about some of the neuroscience research and what we know about neurotransmitters, which are hormones in our brains, or just hormones that work throughout our body. And what we see is that connection makes a difference. It helps us perform at the top of our game. It reduces stress hormones, the most famous being cortisol, that's talked about frequently in the management press. It boosts dopamine, which is a reward chemical that when it makes us feel, it enhances our attention, makes us feel pleasure. So it's called part of the reward circuitry of the brain. It affects serotonin that reduces fear and worry so that we can focus on our work. And it also boosts trust, the trust hormone, oxytocin, that just makes us feel more connected to others around us. So we see that not only is the allocation of blood glucose, and oxygen affected by those feelings of connection and safety, but also these neurochemicals, the neurotransmitters and hormones that affect our body are also impacted by that sense of connection or that sense of disconnection that some people have. And we see this in other science, that from the time we are born to our twilight years in life, connection helps us thrive. Babies who are held and feel connected are healthier. In fact, on average, they have a health benefit, both mental and physical, that lasts over the course of their lives versus children who have been neglected or abused. Elementary school students who receive positive, affirming eye contact and head nods from their teachers, they perform better academically. Patients who have social support or connection recover faster. Adults with greater connection are more creative. They're better problem solvers. They're also more resilient. And seniors with greater connection live longer. So you can see all the benefits here of connection and why some neuroscientists have called connection a superpower. And we also see it in other research that connection helps us not only in our lives in general as individuals, but also it affects connection in the workplace affects us. So this is a longitudinal study that was done in Israel. It was a 20-year study. And what they found was over the course of those 20 years, there was a 240% higher rate of morbidity for people who reported they were in disconnected cultures. Now, I took this quote right out of the report. What they said was only one main effect was found. The risk of mortality was significantly lower for those who reported peer social support, or what I would call a connection. So the relevant question is, what kind of culture are you in? If you're a leader, what kind of culture are you creating? Are you creating a culture that's life-giving to people, both in terms of their productivity and the length of their lives and the joy they experience in life, or is it a culture that's really diminishing them, that's diminishing their productivity and on average, reducing their lifespan? And we see that other studies, the Whitehall studies, which many of you are probably familiar with, were huge studies done in the mid-60s and the mid-80s. And what they did is they studied the UK civil service, which is very highly segmented according to rank. You know, they're actually, as you go up the hierarchy, there are different numerical numbers assigned to that level of the hierarchy. And what they found in the research was there was an inverse correlation between stress, mortality, and hierarchy. So in other words, the more responsibility you had in the hierarchy, the lower your stress level and the better your mortality numbers were. And they attributed this to just the effect of psychosocial factors, and they concluded that and recommended that to reduce stress and improve mortality, greater autonomy and connection was needed in the cultures. and those recommendations have really been maintained over time. So just to sum it up, there's also a competitive advantage I want to point out in the workplace that we see in other research shows that 20% the employee who reports feeling connected and engaged in the workplace has at least a 20% productivity advantage. In other words, an extra day of productivity a week. They're 87% less likely to leave, and this really comes from Gallup's research, every measure they've assessed has moved in a favorable direction from a business outcome standpoint in business units where people report feeling engaged and connected. So in other words, it's rational to be intentional about connection. And to really sum up all this research that I've just gone through, connection equals thriving and disconnection equals dysfunction. And this applies both to individuals and to organizational performance. So what should you look for in leaders who create connection cultures? Here's a simple way to think of it. Leaders who create connection cultures, they communicate an inspiring vision and they live it. They walk the talk, they value people, and they give them a voice. Now, to operationalize a connection culture, here are some things you should keep in mind. Number one, it really is a subculture by subculture battle, because if you think about your organization, you probably say you work on a particular floor, you can probably find teams that have subcultures where people feel connected. They're engaged, they're energetic, they're enthusiastic, and you may be able to walk 50 feet down the hall and find a team that has a culture of control or a culture of indifference, and it's sucking the life out of them. So it really is a subculture by subculture assessment. And it's important to provide training to help people understand and have a vocabulary for connection and for control and for indifference and what creates a connection culture. It helps for them to have examples and practices. And as part of this, I'm going to offer you a free ebook at the end that has 100 ways to connect. So you're going to have plenty of things that are actionable. Accountability, we believe that every organization should have an annual employee engagement survey. Employee engagement measures connection when you look at the questions on most engagement surveys, and that's one way to hold managers accountable for creating connection cultures, and also identify managers who need some help in order to create a connection culture. And then, of course, coaching and mentoring. I think one of our clients not long ago did a global engagement survey with us in 16 different languages. And the CEO of the organization made a leader of one particular unit who just had phenomenally positive engagement, made him the vice chairman of the firm. And now he is out mentoring other leaders around the world to help them create great workplace cultures. So coaching and mentoring are a very important part of this. Now let me also just give you, out of the 100 ways to connect, let me just share a few examples out of that. You'll get the document if you sign up for it, but here are just some examples. Number one, it's important to recognize that people have different connection needs. And that really depends on, there's a biological effect that's been passed on through their parents, through their grandparents, genes to them. So whether they're sensitive to connection in terms of their need for connection, or whether they have a lower connection need, is both genetic but also experiential. What they've experienced since the time of conception changes that set point and their need for connection. So just recognize that people have varying needs, and you don't want to treat everyone in your team the same because their needs are different. Secondly, it's important to get to know people, your direct reports in particular. Know their stories, understand what work experiences and cultures they were a part of in the past, what really fired them up and what made them feel like they were burning out. And by asking those questions and also getting to know more about their interests outside of work, you'll gain some insights that will help you understand what type of culture and how you should interact with them in a way where they will be fired up. And then also, I say this because in our day and age, our smartphones are so engaging, and we see this in our employee engagement research, that just more and more employees feel like when they're interacting with their manager, their supervisor, that their supervisors aren't present. And so just the importance of putting the email away and the smartphone away and really focusing in the meetings that we have with our direct reports and others. It's important to emphasize positives, and we look at the research of John Gottman, the psychologist who studied marriages and came up with the positivity ratio of 5 to 1. In other words, he could predict, based on the research, they saw that where interactions had a ratio of 5 to 1 in terms of positive to a negative interaction in the context of marriage, those marriages tended to survive if the ratio was 5 to 1 or greater. If it dipped below 5 to 1, there was a higher probability that the marriage wouldn't survive. Now, there has been some research about the positivity ratio as it applies in the workplace, and there's been some controversy about what that ratio is. But I would say just the key point is it's really important to make sure that those interactions are overwhelmingly positive that you have with employees so that they feel connected and you maintain the relationship and maintain trust. Providing feedback using constructive language, one of the things we talk about is just the importance of using practices like 3 pluses and a wish. When you're communicating with an employee who you need to deliver a message that they need to improve in some way, then at least affirming them with 3 positive things. So for example, you could say, Tom, I think you're really great at this, and I really appreciate this about you and the other thing, and you would be even better, Tom, if you did this or if you stopped doing this. But the whole point is to really make deposits into that relationship bank account in advance and to use positive language like, Tom, you would even be better if you did this, or refrain from doing that, rather than saying, Tom, you really need to, sometimes being too direct can be very threatening to them and result in disconnection in the relationship. So that's something we talk about more at length in the 100 Ways to Connect that you can sign up for. The next one, here's a simple practice. When you go in and out of small meetings with a small number of people, just taking the time to say hi and goodbye to everyone. It's just a simple thing, but if individuals in that group are especially sensitive to connection, if you don't connect with them in that way, they will feel a lack of connection and to some degree feel slighted that you haven't taken the initiative to connect with them. So that's a very simple practice. It's a layup from a basketball standpoint. Because we have mirror neurons in our brain, we have the ability to feel others' emotions. And when we feel another's emotion, it enhances their emotion if it's a positive emotion, and it diminishes their pain if it's a negative emotion. So for example, if a salesperson has closed a huge sale, to be able to experience that joy with them and celebrate that will enhance the emotion for them. If you have employees who are struggling in some way, just to be able to converse with them and just talk through some of those issues and feel what they're feeling will help diminish their pain. And the end result of those two is when you feel others' emotions, it connects you to them, and vice versa. Looking for ways to proactively help others connects us, and we talk about that in the 100 Ways to Connect, some ways you can do that. The attitude of just expecting the best in people. We see that some people go into relationships with a very negative attitude, and so no wonder they struggle with connection. So really starting out on the right foot by expecting the best in people helps us connect with them. And then another mindset, another attitude that's important is when we negotiate with others, negotiating to solve problems rather than to win. Looking to identify what they're trying to achieve in the negotiation so that we can hopefully identify a solution that will make them feel like they got what they hoped for and we get what we're looking for. It's almost like solving a puzzle rather than having an attitude of I'm going to win and they're going to lose. We're just trying to beat them. So attitudes play an important part in connection too. Okay, I want to, as we get close to taking questions here, I want to offer this to you, and you can email me direct and we'll pull this out of the emails, and what we'll do is we'll send you the 100 Ways to Connect ebook, and it's a 27-page ebook that you can print out, and it has 100 attitudes, uses of language, and behaviors, both individual and institutional behaviors that will help you connect. And we hope that you also buy our book that really explains the the rationale behind it. The book is Connection Culture. It's available at all book outlets. And we can open it up now. You can see the directions there. Just email me at that address and put HRDQ offer and include your name and email address, and we'll email you back a link to download the 100 Ways to Connect ebook. So Sarah, I'd be glad to take questions now.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. We have about 10 minutes for that live Q&A, so attendees go ahead and submit those now to me. And while we wait for some of those to filter in, I'm just going to tell you a little bit how to keep in touch with us. You can always connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. And also, you can register for our weekly webinar Wednesdays at HRDQ-U.com. So, okay, looks like we have a number of questions coming in. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Our first question is coming from Tom. How does this apply to different generations of employees?
Well, Tom, that's a good question. I find there's a lot of interest, particularly in the millennials. And what we see in the research is that in the generation that is up near retirement age, that generation actually tends to be pretty good at connection. Now, certainly there are exceptions, but we do find in the millennial generation in particular, and this was interesting, McCann World Group did a survey of 7,000 millennials a couple of years ago. They're actually redoing the survey this summer. And what they found was their #1 value is connection. And it's interesting to see that because there's it doesn't mean they're experiencing it. And I think that's where there's a great deal of frustration, that they have the expectation going into the workplace that they're going to experience connection, but they don't experience it oftentimes because the cultures they're in are not connecting. And it creates this difference between expectation and reality that results in a sense of depression setting in. And so I would say just with the millennials in particular, there's a very high felt need for connection that's not being experienced. So I hope that addresses, if you want to talk about that more, we could connect offline.
All right, great, thank you. And it looks like our next question is coming from Tina. Doesn't connection have to start at the top of the organization?
Well, I hear that question a lot, and certainly that's ideal, Tina, to have the CEO or the senior leadership team who really believes in connection. One of the articles it makes me think about an article I wrote about the U.S. Navy in 2000 had a situation where they were not meeting their first-term reenlistment goals. And Admiral Vern Clark, the Chief of Naval Operations, he's the Chief of the Navy on the Joint Chiefs, he was promoted from being commander of the Atlantic Fleet. And within 18 months, first-term reenlistment boosted from under 38% to 56.7%. The Navy had never seen anything like that in its history. And it's amazing to see just the number of things that Admiral Clark did that created connection. So that's one example that we see of. And I'd be glad to email that case study to you. But let me also point this out. That's certainly ideal, having a leader from the top who creates connection like Admiral Clark. But that's usually not the case. And when you think about the research, what we see is every organization has cultures, subcultures of control, subcultures of indifference, and subcultures of connection. And what that tells me is that it's the subculture that matters the most. So my advice to you would be, don't worry about what your CEO does. It's certainly great if your CEO is going to create a connection culture. You want that. But the most important culture for you is the subculture that you're in. That's the culture that you can influence and that will have the greatest impact on your health, on your productivity, on your happiness at work. So focus on improving the subculture that you're in. And just this 100 Ways to Connect document will really give you some very tangible ways to do that.
All right, great, thank you. Our next question is coming from Cynthia. How do you encourage connections during acquisitions?
Well, we actually do some post-merger culture work with organizations, and that I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of my career on Wall Street, and went through a number of mergers and acquisitions. Well, first of all, what we try to do in our work is, number one, understand the cultures of the two organizations that are merging. We will sit down with the leadership teams and help them understand the difference in the three cultures of connection, control, and indifference. And then take their values, try to put them together in a way to cast a vision for a new culture that's a connection culture. So that's the approach we take. And then, also things like employee engagement surveys are important because there's going to be realignment, probably some responsibilities will change, and you want to hold those managers accountable to create connection cultures. So that means you have to give employees a voice to let us know how they're doing, how their managers are doing, and then intervene in ways that are appropriate. If they need additional training, they need coaching and mentoring to help them create connection culture, so be it. In some cases, just leadership changes may be necessary. So that's a very quick synopsis of some of the things that have to take place after a merger to really result in creating the best culture, a connection culture for the combined organization.
All right, perfect. Thank you. And looks like our next question is coming from Ken. How have you been measuring, or what metrics have you used to demonstrate impact of connection?
Well, I would, if you're asking about metrics, I would refer you to the Science of Connection chapter in our book, because it really has a very detailed articulation of how, including quantitative data and peer-reviewed research that shows three things. Number one, that connection does affect individual performance. Number two, that connection has a positive effect on organizational performance. And then number three, that our current state of connection today is not good and getting worse. So I would really refer you to that. There's a lot of research that supports this, but it would be hard for me to take you through that in a convincing way in a short time. So I'd really just encourage you to look deeper. And as I said, that there's a long chapter in the book that includes endnotes that would take you to the original research.
All right, great, thank you. And it looks like we probably have time for just one more question, and that one is going to be coming from Diane. What impact does ethics play in cultural connections understanding?
Well, that's let me just say a couple things about ethics. Number one, that obviously organizations that are ethical are going to tend to have, being ethical is a condition precedent to creating a connection culture. If you have leaders who are unethical, it will definitely undermine connection in the organization, just as it undermines trust. So there's a high correlation between the ethics of an organization, trust, and connection. Now, the other thing, we didn't have time to get in this webinar to character strengths or character strengths and virtues, but in our work, we use the 24 universal character strengths and virtues that are cited by the positive psychology movement. And what we found is that those are really components of the vision, value, voice model that I talked about earlier. And if you went to our company's website, there are a lot of articles out there that go deeper into this, and of course the book goes deeper into it. But there is a connection between ethics and values and character strengths that creates connection. So you're getting a little bit deeper than we've had time to get into, and I think your mind's in the right place in terms of what's ultimately important is that we have character strengths and good values and ethics in organizations, and that's what creates connection. So one piece you might take a look at that I wrote that is on our epluribuspartners.com website under articles is a manifesto called Connection Culture, the Competitive Advantage of it's the competitive advantage of connection cultures. It's a changethis.com manifesto that actually gets into that particular topic.
All right, great. Those are some awesome questions. And Mike, would you just like to add any final thoughts before I go ahead and just close out the session for today then?
Well, Sarah, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining us. And I really hope that people take advantage of signing up for the 100 Ways to Connect ebook, because I think you'll find that is very practical, not only to help you get greater connection in your teams, but also it doesn't take much stretch of the imagination to think about how this will improve your connection in your family, in your community, and in other groups you're involved in. So I wish you all the very best.
All right, Mike, thank you so much again. And for the attendees, if we did not get to answer your questions, you will receive an emailed response probably about mid-next week from those answered questions from Mike. So we appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative. Thank you.